Millionaire beats. Pregnant wife into a coma. Two brothers return for revenge, making him pay dearly. Hook a $47,000 diamond necklace receipt. That is what it took to unravel a $340 million empire built on lies, murder, and the systematic destruction of innocent women. Eleanor Mitchell found that receipt in her husband's coat pocket on a Tuesday afternoon. The engraving request said, "To my forever V." Her name was Eleanor. Not Victoria, not Vanessa, not any name starting with V. She was 8 months pregnant with twins, and she had just discovered that her entire marriage was a carefully orchestrated trap designed by a family that had already gotten away with murder once before. What happened next would land her in a coma, fighting for her life. Her premature babies would spend weeks in the NICU, their tiny lungs struggling with every breath, and her two brothers, a former Army Ranger and a criminal defense attorney, would wage a war against one of the most powerful families in Connecticut. This is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what happens when predators underestimate their prey, when they assume that money and connections can silence the truth forever, when they forget that some people have family who will burn the world down to protect them. By the end of this story, a $340 million empire would be in ruins. A matriarch who thought she was untouchable would die behind bars, and a man who believed he could literally get away with murder would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell. But first, Eleanor had to survive. Value Lesson 1: The Power of Quiet Observation. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I want to share something important that might save your life or the life of someone you love. Eleanor's grandmother raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 22 years old. That grandmother taught her a lesson that would eventually save her life and the lives of her unborn children. The lesson was simple. When you find something that does not make sense, do not confront, observe. The truth reveals itself to those who watch quietly. This is one of the most powerful pieces of advice anyone in a dangerous situation can receive. Our instinct when we discover betrayal is to confront immediately, to demand answers, to express our hurt and anger. But confrontation alerts the predator. It gives them time to prepare their defense, to destroy evidence, to craft their lies, to tighten their control. Observation, on the other hand, is invisible. It allows you to gather information, to understand the full scope of what you are dealing with, to prepare your escape before they even know you are planning one. If you are watching this and something in your relationship does not make sense, if your partner's explanations leave you more confused than before, if your instincts are telling you something is wrong, remember Eleanor's grandmother's advice. Do not confront, observe, document, plan. And when you are ready to act, act decisively, now. If you find value in stories like this, stories that entertain but also provide real wisdom for navigating difficult situations, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We share stories like this every week, and I promise each one will leave you thinking long after it ends. Let us continue with Eleanor's story. Chapter 1: The Receipt. Eleanor Mitchell stood in the walk-in closet of their $12 million Connecticut mansion, her hands trembling as she held the Tiffany receipt. The date showed it was purchased 2 weeks ago. The total was $47,000. The engraving request read, "To my forever V." At 34 years old and 8 months pregnant with twins, Eleanor had learned to trust her instincts. 6 years of marriage to Marcus Whitfield had taught her many things, but the most important lesson came from her grandmother. When you find something that does not make sense, do not confront, observe. The truth reveals itself to those who watch quietly. Eleanor tucked the receipt back into the coat pocket exactly as she had found it. She smoothed the fabric carefully, making sure nothing looked disturbed. She stepped back and examined the closet as if she had never touched anything. Then she waited. Marcus Whitfield arrived home 2 hours later in his Bentley Continental. At 48 years old, silver-tempered and impeccably dressed in custom Italian suits, he was the CEO of Whitfield Capital Management. His net worth was $340 million. Third-generation wealth. He had never truly worked for anything in his entire life. In public, Marcus was charming, philanthropic, the kind of man who made generous donations and shook hands with politicians. The kind of man other men wanted to be and women wanted to be with. In private, he was something else entirely. He kissed Eleanor's forehead and placed his manicured hand on her swollen belly. "How are my boys today?" He asked with that smile that used to make her heart flutter. Eleanor forced herself to smile back. She had become an expert at forcing smiles over the past 6 years. "They are active, kicking all afternoon." She did not mention the receipt. Not yet. That night. Eleanor lay awake while Marcus snored beside her. She thought about the past 2 years, the way he had slowly, systematically convinced her that her 2 older brothers were bad influences. "Jack has that temper," Marcus would say, shaking his head with practiced concern. "Remember what happened at Christmas. He is volatile. Eleanor, dangerous. Daniel drinks too much," he would add. "I have seen men like him, functioning alcoholics. They seem fine until they are not. You do not need that negativity in your life. They are not good people. Eleanor, you deserve better than their chaos. You have me now. You have my family. That is enough." She had not seen Jack or Daniel in 2 years. They lived in Texas, and somehow the distance had grown until phone calls became rare and visits became impossible. Every time she suggested flying out to see them, something came up: a work emergency, a family obligation, a health concern that Marcus manufactured out of thin air. Now, lying in the darkness, with that receipt burned into her memory. Eleanor wondered if the distance had been engineered, if her isolation from the 2 people who would have seen through Marcus immediately was not coincidence, but strategy. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor observed, she noticed things she had somehow missed before, or perhaps things she had noticed but forced herself to ignore, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that her entire life was a lie. Marcus kept his phone face down now. He had started doing that about 6 months ago, she realized, around the time the receipt was dated. He was buying jewelry for someone else. He worked late every Tuesday and Thursday. She used to believe him when he said it was board meetings and client dinners. Now she wondered who he was really meeting. He showered immediately when he came home, even when he had supposedly been in an office all day. He never used to do that. He wore a new cologne, expensive, not the one she had bought him for their anniversary. $47,000 for a necklace, she thought bitterly. "I asked for a $200 prenatal massage last month, and he said we needed to watch our spending, said we were overextended, said the economy was uncertain. Apparently we only watch my spending on the 4th night." Eleanor waited until Marcus fell into his deep, satisfied sleep, the sleep of a man who believed he had everything under control. She took his phone to the bathroom and locked the door. She knew his password, their wedding date. The irony was not lost on her. What she found made her blood run cold. Hundreds of messages with someone named V. The messages went back 14 months. Long before Eleanor got pregnant, there were photos she wished she could unsee. Victoria, whoever she was younger than Eleanor, blonde, beautiful in the way women are beautiful when they have never known real struggle. There were transfer confirmations showing $50,000 per month going to an account labeled VR Holdings, $50,000 every single month for over a year. That was more than $600,000 to a mistress, while Marcus told Eleanor they needed to be careful about spending. And then Eleanor found the conversation that stopped her heart. It was from that very morning. Marcus had written to V, "Soon, baby. Once the prenatal agreement kicks in, we will be free. She will get nothing, and you will get everything." Eleanor's hands began to shake so badly, she almost dropped the phone. She scrolled back through the messages, her eyes scanning for any mention of herself. She found it quickly. A message from 14 months ago, before she was even pregnant. Marcus had written, "My mother found someone perfect. Her name is Victoria. This is going to work." Victoria had replied, "And your wife?" Marcus had answered, "Eleanor will not be a problem much longer. Trust me." Eleanor pressed her hand against her belly. The babies kicked as if they could sense her fear, as if they were trying to warn her. She was not looking at an affair that had happened. She was looking at an affair that had been planned, orchestrated. Before she was even pregnant, her pregnancy was not an accident. It was part of something, part of a plan she did not understand yet. And the words, "Eleanor will not be a problem much longer," echoed in her mind like a warning from beyond the grave. She took screenshots of everything, every message, every photo, every financial transfer. She sent them to her own email address. Then she deleted the sent record and cleared the recent activity. That night, Eleanor lay next to a stranger. A man she had shared a bed with for 6 years. A man whose children grew inside her. A man who was apparently planning something that would make her not a problem. She did not know what their plan was yet. She did not know how deep the conspiracy went. She did not know how many people were involved. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was in danger. And so were her babies. Chapter 2. The trap closes. Eleanor spent the next 48 hours planning her escape. She would go to Texas. Her brothers would help her figure this out. Jack was a former Army Ranger who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. After his military service, he had founded a private security consulting firm that worked with high net worth individuals and corporate clients. He knew about protection, about surveillance, about the kinds of threats that ordinary people never considered. Daniel was one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the state of Texas. He had spent 15 years learning how the legal system worked and, more importantly, how it could be manipulated by people with money and power. He would know what to do with the evidence Eleanor had gathered. Together, her brothers would know how to protect her, how to fight back. She packed a small bag, while Marcus was at work. Just the essentials: clothes, documents, the prenatal vitamins she needed. She hid the bag in the back of her closet, behind the boxes of baby clothes she had been collecting. She called for an Uber to the train station, scheduling it for the next morning when Marcus would be in back-to-back meetings. She would take the train to New York, then fly to Dallas. She would be in Texas before Marcus even knew she was gone. That night at dinner, she tested him, just to be sure. "Marcus," she said carefully, keeping her voice light and casual, "I have been thinking. I want to reconnect with my brothers. I have not seen Jack and Daniel in 2 years. Marcus set down his fork. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. If Eleanor had not been watching for it, she might have missed it entirely. "Baby," he said with that concerned voice he used when he was about to deny her something. "We have talked about this. Jack has that temper. Remember what happened at your mother's funeral? He was out of control." Jack had cried at their mother's funeral. He had been devastated. Marcus had twisted that grief into evidence of instability. "Daniel drinks too much." Marcus continued, "I have seen the way he gets after a few glasses of wine. Sloppy, unpredictable. They are not good influences. Especially now with the twins coming, we need to surround ourselves with stable, positive people." Eleanor kept her voice calm, reasonable, unthreatening. "I miss them. I am going to call them tomorrow." The charm dropped from Marcus's face like a mask being removed. His voice went cold in a way she had heard before, but had always made excuses for. "Eleanor." I said no. "Do not make me repeat myself." She saw it then. A flash of something dangerous in his eyes. Something predatory. How had she missed it for 6 years? How had she convinced herself that his control was protection, that his isolation of her from everyone she loved was concern? The next morning, Eleanor woke early. She dressed quietly in comfortable clothes for travel. She retrieved her hidden bag from the closet. She checked her phone. The Uber was 8 minutes away. She was going to make it. She was going to escape. She was going to save herself and her babies. Then she heard the front door open. Marcus walked in. He was supposed to be in a board meeting. He was supposed to be gone until evening. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Eleanor froze. The bag was in her hand. There was no way to hide it, no excuse that would explain it away. "I have a doctor appointment," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Really?" Marcus walked closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. "Because your doctor's office said you do not have an appointment today when I called to check. And the Uber app on our family account shows you requested a ride to the train station." Family account. He monitored everything. Every app, every purchase, every movement. She had been living in a surveillance state and had not even realized it. Marcus stepped closer. His voice was soft, almost gentle. Somehow that made it worse than if he had been screaming. "You are not feeling well, Eleanor. The pregnancy hormones are making you confused, making you paranoid. I am calling Dr. Harrison. He will give you something to help you relax." "Marcus, please. I just need—" "You need rest. For the babies. For our family." He took her phone, her keys, her wallet, her bag. He led her to the master bedroom and locked the door from the outside. She heard the click of the deadbolt that had been installed without her knowledge. Through the door, she heard him on the phone. "Yes, she is having an episode," he said to whoever was listening. "Paranoid delusions. She tried to run away. Very concerning behavior for someone so far along in her pregnancy. Yes, we might need to discuss options after the birth. Postpartum psychosis runs in her family. You know, postpartum psychosis did not run in Eleanor's family. Her mother and grandmother had both been perfectly healthy after giving birth. He was building a case. He was making her look unstable, creating documentation, establishing a narrative, and whatever happened next, no one would believe her. She would be the crazy pregnant woman, the one with the hormonal episodes, the one whose wealthy, philanthropic husband was just trying to help her. For 3 days, Marcus kept Eleanor confined to the house. A nurse named Brenda arrived on the second day, supposedly to help with the high-risk pregnancy. She was efficient, professional, and reported every single conversation to Marcus. The vitamins Brenda gave Eleanor made her drowsy. She slept 12 hours at a time and woke up foggy and confused when she tried to refuse the vitamins. Brenda smiled and said they were necessary for the baby's health. Her phone was broken and being repaired. Marcus told her the landline had been disconnected due to a billing error that would be fixed soon. Her laptop had been taken to be cleaned of viruses. Every avenue of communication was closed. Every escape route was blocked. I always wanted a live-in nurse during my pregnancy. Eleanor thought bitterly during one of her few lucid moments. I just pictured less imprisonment. On the third day, something changed. The housekeeper, Margaret Crawford, had worked for the Whitfield family for 15 years. She was 62 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes. She had raised 5 children alone after her husband died of a heart attack, working 2 jobs for years before the Whitfields hired her. She had seen things in this house that she had kept quiet about, to preserve her job and feed her grandchildren. But Margaret had limits. She found Eleanor alone in the bedroom during one of Brenda's lunch breaks. She pressed something into Eleanor's palm, a small phone, a burner. "I know what is happening," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting to the door. "I have seen it before, with his first wife." Eleanor's heart stopped. His first wife, Marcus, was never married before. That was what everyone said. That was what Eleanor had been told. "That is what they want everyone to think," Margaret said, reading the question in Eleanor's eyes. Her name was Christine. She had an accident 8 years ago. The case was closed in 3 weeks. But I saw the bruises before she died. I saw the fear in her eyes, just like I see it in yours now. Eleanor stared at the phone in her hand. She was not Marcus's first victim. Christine Whitfield had died in a fall down the stairs in 2016. The investigation was closed in 3 weeks, despite multiple inconsistencies in the evidence. The Whitfield family donated $2 million to the local police foundation that same year. Eleanor understood then. She did not just need to escape, she needed evidence, documentation, proof, or she would end up like Christine. Chapter 3. The night everything changed, Eleanor used the burner phone carefully. She recorded conversations when Marcus did not know she was awake. She photographed documents through the crack under the door when Brenda left files on the hallway table. She built a case file and sent copies to Margaret's personal email for safekeeping. On day 4 of her imprisonment, Marcus discovered the burner phone. He found it tucked inside her pillowcase when she was in the bathroom. When she came out, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, the phone in his hand, his face twisted with a rage she had never seen before. "You ungrateful little nothing," he said. "Marcus, stop. The babies. Think about the babies. The babies are mine, my bloodline, my heirs, the continuation of the Whitfield legacy." He stood up slowly, deliberately. "You are just the vessel. Replaceable, disposable." He walked toward her. Eleanor backed away until her shoulder blades hit the wall. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? Did you really think anyone would believe you over me? I am Marcus Whitfield. I have given millions to charities. I have connections in every courthouse in the state. I have politicians who owe me favors. And you are nobody I picked up at a charity gala because you were pretty enough and naive enough. Please, I will not say anything. I will be quiet. Just let me. You had your chance to be quiet." He grabbed her arm. His grip was crushing. "You had your chance to be a good wife, to play your role. to give me my sons, and then fade into the background, where you belong. But you had to dig. You had to make this difficult. What happened next was fast and brutal. He shoved her backward. She fell against the marble fireplace, her pregnant belly taking some of the impact. Pain exploded through her abdomen. She tried to crawl away, one hand protecting her stomach. He followed. The last thing she saw was his face twisted with rage, his fist raised, and the gold wedding band that she had placed on his finger 6 years ago glinting in the afternoon light. Then darkness, when Eleanor stopped moving. Marcus stood over her, breathing hard. He looked down at his wife's crumpled form. He saw the blood beginning to pool beneath her. He saw her eyes, unfocused and still. He saw that she was not responding to any stimuli. For a moment, he did nothing but stand there and process. Then his survival instinct kicked in. Not survival instinct for Eleanor or the babies. Survival instinct for himself and his empire. He could not call an ambulance. Not like this. There would be questions, documentation, mandatory reporting. A pregnant woman beaten unconscious would trigger investigations he could not control. Her injuries were clearly not from a fall, but he also could not let her die here in the bedroom. Not like this. Not where the evidence pointed directly to him, with no alternative explanation. He made a decision. He dragged Eleanor's unconscious body across the hardwood floor, down the hallway, to the top of the grand staircase. The marble stairs that were the pride of the Whitfield mansion. 16 steps from top to bottom. He positioned her body carefully at the edge of the top step, made sure it would look natural. Then he pushed. Her body tumbled down all 16 marble steps, gaining momentum, twisting and breaking until she landed at the bottom in a crumpled heap. Now it was a fall. Marcus called 911. His voice was panicked, practiced, perfect. Please help me. My wife fell down the stairs. She is 8 months pregnant. She is not moving. Please, send someone quickly. He hung up and waited for the ambulance, his story already fully formed in his mind. She was dizzy. The pregnancy. She lost her balance at the top of the stairs. I tried to catch her, but I was in the study. I heard her scream, and by the time I got there, she was already at the bottom. By the time the paramedics arrived, Marcus Whitfield was the picture of a devastated husband, tears streaming down his face, hands shaking, voice breaking. No one questioned him. No one ever questioned a Whitfield. Eleanor was rushed to Greenwich Hospital in critical condition. The doctors performed emergency surgery. A cesarean section at 32 weeks to save the twins, whose heartbeats were becoming dangerously irregular. The babies, Samuel and Thomas, weighed barely 4 pounds each. They were placed in the NICU immediately, their underdeveloped lungs struggling with every breath, their tiny bodies fighting battles they should not have had to fight for another 2 months. Eleanor was placed in a medically induced coma. The damage was extensive: severe traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding from multiple organ damage, 4 broken ribs, a fractured pelvis, a shattered wrist from trying to break her fall down the stairs. The doctors told Marcus that she might not wake up. And if she did wake up, there was no telling what kind of cognitive function she would have. Marcus accepted their words with appropriate devastation. He sat in the waiting room, accepting condolences from friends and colleagues, playing the role of a grieving husband preparing for the worst, while reporters gathered outside and the story of the tragic accident spread across local news. Prominent philanthropist's pregnant wife in critical condition after tragic fall. The headlines painted exactly the picture Marcus wanted painted. That same night, Margaret Crawford was fired. Security guards appeared at her quarters and told her she had 30 minutes to vacate the property. She was not allowed to collect all of her personal belongings. She was escorted off the premises and told that any attempt to contact the family or speak to media would result in legal action. But Margaret Crawford had raised 5 children alone. She had worked 2 jobs for a decade. She had survived things that would have broken weaker people. And she was not stupid. Before the guards even knocked on her door, Margaret had already hidden the micro SD card containing all of Eleanor's evidence. She had tucked it into a place where no one would think to search. As she sat in her car outside the Whitfield estate, shaking with fear and rage and grief, Margaret made a decision. She pulled out her own phone. She dialed a number that Eleanor had made her memorize weeks ago, just in case something happened. A man answered on the first ring. His voice was deep and wary. "Hello? Mr. Mitchell, this is Margaret Crawford. I worked for the Whitfield family." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "Your sister is in the hospital. She is in a coma. That man almost killed her. And the babies? They are in the NICU. They might not make it." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Jack Mitchell spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its calmness. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Do not leave out a single detail. And give me that hospital address." Chapter 4. The Brothers. Jack Mitchell was 42 years old and built like a tank. 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle that he maintained with the same discipline he had learned in the Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Rangers had taught him things that most people would never understand. He had learned how to stay calm when everything around him was chaos, how to plan methodically when every emotion screamed for immediate action, how to assess threats and neutralize them completely and permanently. He had been worried about Eleanor for 2 years. The calls had become less frequent until they stopped entirely. The visits had been canceled again and again until there were no more visits. Every time he tried to reach her directly, Marcus would answer and make excuses. "Eleanor is resting. Eleanor is not feeling well. Eleanor is busy with a charity event. Eleanor will call you back when she has time." She never called back. Now Jack knew why. Now he understood that the distance had been engineered, that his baby sister had been isolated from everyone who would have seen through Marcus's carefully constructed facade. He would never forgive himself for not pushing harder, for not showing up unannounced, for not trusting his instincts when they told him something was wrong. But guilt was a luxury he could not afford right now. Right now, he had work to do. Daniel Mitchell was 38 years old, brilliant, analytical, and one of the most successful criminal defense attorneys in Texas. He had graduated top of his class from Stanford Law. He had spent 15 years learning exactly how the legal system could be manipulated by people with money and power. More importantly, he had spent 15 years learning how to fight back against that manipulation. Daniel was already packing a bag when Jack called him. "I will meet you at the airport," Daniel said without preamble. "Do not do anything until I get there. I mean it. Jack, if we are going to take down a family like the Whitfields, we have to do it right. I am not promising anything. Jack, listen to me. I know you want to walk in there and put that man through a wall. I want that too. But if we do this wrong, if we give them any ammunition, they will use it against us and Eleanor. They will paint us as the dangerous brothers Marcus warned her about. They will use our anger to validate their narrative." Jack was silent for a long moment. "Fine. But if I see that man touch her again, if he touches her again, I will help you hide the body. But until then, we do this my way." They arrived at Greenwich Hospital 14 hours later. They had not slept. They had barely eaten. They had driven through the night, taking turns at the wheel, planning their approach. What they found when they arrived made Jack's blood boil with a rage he had not felt since Afghanistan. Eleanor lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. Tubes ran into her arms and nose. Monitors beeped with every weak heartbeat. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, purple and black with bruises. Her wrist was encased in a cast. She was breathing, but only with help. The doctors said she might have brain damage. They would not know the extent until she woke up, if she woke up, in the NICU 2 floors up. Samuel and Thomas fought for survival in their incubators. 4 pounds each, lungs that were not fully developed, feeding tubes because they were too weak to nurse. Every hour was a battle that these tiny babies should not have had to fight. And in the waiting room of the ICU, Marcus Whitfield sat in a $3,000 suit, accepting sympathy from a steady stream of visitors, playing the role of the devoted husband whose world had been shattered by tragedy. Jack walked directly toward him. Marcus saw him coming and stood. His expression flickered with recognition, then fear, before settling into practiced concern. The transformation took less than a second. "Jack, Daniel, thank God you are here. Eleanor needs her family right now. This has been so traumatic for all of us." Jack stepped close enough that only Marcus could hear him. Close enough that the visitors would see 2 men having an emotional conversation about a shared tragedy. "If my sister dies," Jack said quietly, "I will destroy everything you have ever built. Your company, your reputation, your family name. I will burn it all to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And if my nephews do not make it." He smiled, and it was worse than any threat. "Well, let us just hope they make it." Marcus's smile did not waver, but a bead of sweat appeared at his temple. "Are you threatening me in front of all these people, in a hospital where my wife is fighting for her life?" "I do not make threats, Marcus. I make promises. And I keep every single one." Daniel stepped between them before anything could escalate. His voice was calm and professional, exactly the tone you would expect from a concerned family member. "We are here for Eleanor. That is all that matters right now. We are going to stay as long as it takes." They spent the next 3 hours in Eleanor's room, watching her breathe, watching the machines measure what her body could not communicate, holding her hand and promising her that they were there now and they were not leaving. Then they got to work. Value Lesson 2, The Power of Documentation. I want to pause here and talk about something critically important that everyone watching this needs to understand. Documentation saved Eleanor's life. The screenshots she took, the recordings Margaret made, the evidence she gathered during those 3 days of captivity. All of it mattered. If you are in any situation where someone is treating you badly, whether it is a spouse, a boss, a family member, or anyone else, documentation is your most powerful weapon. Save every text message. Screenshot every conversation. Keep a journal with dates and times of incidents. Send copies to multiple email addresses that only you can access. Tell someone you trust what is happening. Evidence is hard to dispute. Memories fade, stories can be twisted, but documentation creates a record that exists outside of anyone's ability to manipulate it. Eleanor could not have known when she took those screenshots that they would eventually help bring down one of the most powerful families in Connecticut. She just knew that something was wrong and she needed proof. That instinct, that willingness to document even when she did not know exactly what she would do with the evidence, made all the difference. Remember this lesson. You never know when documentation might save your life or help you escape a dangerous situation. Now let us continue with the story. Chapter 5. The investigation begins. Daniel requested copies of Eleanor's complete medical records the day after they arrived. He interviewed the nurses who had treated her. He talked to the doctors who had performed the emergency surgery. He asked questions about injury patterns and impact angles and whether anything about her condition seemed inconsistent with a fall. The answers were deeply troubling. The bruising pattern on Eleanor's arms was not consistent with a fall. The marks suggested defensive wounds, the kind that occur when someone is trying to protect themselves from being hit. There were grip marks on her upper arms, the kind that occur when someone is being grabbed and held. Her internal injuries were not consistent with a single impact from falling downstairs. The pattern suggested multiple impacts, as if she had been struck repeatedly before the fall occurred. Officially, I cannot say anything, one doctor told Daniel privately, but off the record, I have seen a lot of accident victims in my career. This does not look like an accident. Jack, meanwhile, met with Margaret Crawford at a coffee shop far outside of Greenwich, somewhere the Whitfields would never think to look. Margaret gave him the micro SD card and told him everything she knew. The messages Eleanor had documented, the financial transfers to Victoria, Gloria's role in orchestrating the entire scheme, Christine Whitfield's death 8 years ago, and the troubling similarities to Eleanor's situation. She told him about the nurse, Brenda, who had been drugging Eleanor to keep her compliant, about the systematic isolation that had cut Eleanor off from everyone who loved her, about the way Marcus had been building a case to have Eleanor declared mentally unstable long before she ever found that receipt. Jack listened without interrupting. He recorded everything with Margaret's permission. When she finished, he asked one question. Would you testify? If it came to that in court, under oath, with their lawyers trying to destroy your credibility? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She was terrified. She had 5 grandchildren who depended on the money she sent them every month. She had worked her entire life and had nothing to show for it except a small apartment and a modest savings account. But she had also watched 2 women be destroyed by the Whitfield family, and she could not live with watching a third. That man killed one woman and almost killed another, she said. I am not staying quiet anymore. Whatever they do to me, I can live with. What I cannot live with is knowing I could have stopped them and did nothing. Jack reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You are not going to face them alone. I promise you that. Chapter 6. The Counterattack. Daniel presented their evidence to the district attorney 5 days after they arrived in Connecticut. Medical records showing injuries inconsistent with a fall. Financial documents showing massive transfers to Marcus's mistress. Witness statements from Margaret Crawford. The SD card with Eleanor's recordings and screenshots. The DA, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had built her career on prosecuting domestic violence cases, agreed that the evidence warranted a full criminal investigation. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to hope. Marcus was brought in for questioning. He arrived with 3 lawyers from one of the most expensive firms in New York. He answered every question with carefully rehearsed responses. He expressed concern for Eleanor's well-being. He denied any involvement in her injuries. But the investigation was moving forward. Forensic accountants were examining his financial records. Detectives were interviewing witnesses. The narrative Marcus had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack. Then Gloria Whitfield made her move. Gloria was 78 years old, silver-haired, and absolutely ruthless. She was the matriarch of the Whitfield family and the real power behind the empire her late husband had built. Old money, old connections, old grudges. She had hated Eleanor from the day Marcus brought her home. Too common, too middle class, too unconnected to the right families. She had spent 6 years waiting for an opportunity to remove this unsuitable woman from her son's life. Now her son was in danger of criminal prosecution, and Gloria did not tolerate threats to her family. Within 72 hours of Daniel's meeting with the DA, Gloria's network activated. Her lawyers filed motions challenging every piece of evidence. The SD card was ruled potentially inadmissible because it had been obtained without Marcus's knowledge. Margaret Crawford faced civil charges for theft of private property and breach of her employment confidentiality agreement. The DA began receiving calls from influential donors expressing concern about the direction of the investigation. Politicians who owed the Whitfield family favors suddenly had opinions about prosecutorial overreach, and the local news ran a story that made Jack want to put his fist through the television screen. Prominent philanthropist Marcus Whitfield, falsely accused by wife's troubled family. The story painted Eleanor as mentally unstable. It mentioned documented episodes of paranoid behavior during her pregnancy. It questioned whether her brothers, neither of whom had seen her in 2 years, might have financial motives for making accusations against a wealthy man. Daniel slammed his laptop shut when the segment ended. They are not just fighting us. They are rewriting history. They are erasing the truth. Jack stared at the wall, processing, calculating. If the local legal system is compromised, we find another way. Daniel shook his head. We cannot do anything illegal. It will destroy any case we might build. It will validate every claim they are making about us being dangerous and unstable. I am not talking about illegal. I am talking about thorough. Jack Mitchell started making calls. He reached out to every contact he had from his military career and his security consulting work, former intelligence officers, private investigators who specialized in the kind of cases that never made it to court, people who knew how to find information that others wanted to stay hidden. He found the detective who had investigated Christine Whitfield's death 8 years ago. The man was retired now, living in Florida, spending his days fishing and his nights haunted by the case he had been forced to close. I knew something was wrong, the detective said when Jack reached him. The injuries did not match a fall. There were defensive wounds on her arms. Her head injury was inconsistent with hitting the bottom step. But my captain told me to close it. Said the Whitfields were major donors to the department. Said there was no evidence of foul play. 3 weeks later, I was reassigned to traffic duty. 6 months after that, I took early retirement. Would you testify if it came to that? The detective was quiet for a long moment. I have been waiting 8 years for someone to ask me that question. Yes, I will testify. Jack found 3 former employees of the Whitfield household who had been paid to stay quiet. He found records of those payments. He found patterns that suggested this family had been silencing witnesses for decades. Daniel tracked the financial angle. Whitfield Capital Management had discrepancies in its books. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, unexplained transfers that did not match any legitimate business purpose. This was not just about domestic violence anymore. This was potentially money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy on a scale that would interest federal prosecutors. And then Jack found Victoria Reeves. Chapter 7, Victoria's Awakening. The mistress lived in a luxury apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side. The apartment was paid for by Marcus. The furniture was purchased by Marcus. The designer clothes in her closet were gifts from Marcus. And all of it was documented on her social media. She had posted a photo of herself wearing the $47,000 diamond necklace 2 weeks before Eleanor found the receipt. The caption read, "When Bae knows your worth," with a diamond emoji. Jack showed up at her apartment building on a Tuesday afternoon. He waited in the lobby until she came down, then followed her to the coffee shop on the corner. Victoria tried to leave when she saw him approach her table. Jack sat down in the chair across from her before she could stand. "Victoria, I am not here to hurt you. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to warn you." She was beautiful. Jack could admit that. 29 years old, blonde, with the kind of bone structure that belonged on magazine covers. But up close, he could see something else in her eyes. Fear. "Warn me about what?" she asked. "About what Marcus does to women who become inconvenient." Victoria's face went pale. She stopped trying to leave. "Who are you?" "I am Jack Mitchell, Eleanor's brother, the woman Marcus beat into a coma 3 weeks ago. The woman who found your necklace receipt and started asking questions she was not supposed to ask." Victoria's hands were trembling. She wrapped them around her coffee cup to try to hide it. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I am talking about. You know about the plan. You know about Gloria. You know about the money. And somewhere deep down, you know that you are not going to live to spend any of it." Jack leaned forward. "Have you ever heard the name Christine Whitfield?" All the remaining color drained from Victoria's face. She let Jack inside her apartment because the alternative was worse. She had seen things in the past 14 months that she could not unsee. She had heard things she could not unhear. And lately, she had started to wonder if she was next. Jack sat across from her in the living room of her luxury prison and told her what he knew. "I know about the plan. I know Gloria recruited you. I know about the money and the messages and the timeline. I know this has been in motion since before Eleanor even got pregnant." Victoria's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to put down her coffee cup. "How do you know about Gloria?" "Because my sister documented everything. Before Marcus beat her unconscious and pushed her down 16 marble steps. I did not know he was going to hurt her." Victoria's voice broke. "I swear to God, I did not know. Gloria said it would just be a divorce. Said Eleanor would be taken care of. Said no one would get hurt. But you knew something. Something that made you keep copies of conversations. Something that made you change the password on your cloud backup, so Marcus could not access it." Victoria's eyes went wide. "How did you—" "I told you. I am very good at finding things people want to keep hidden." Jack's voice softened slightly. "Tell me what you knew. All of it." Victoria told him everything. Gloria had found her 3 years ago. A struggling actress with mounting debts, desperate for money, about to be evicted from her apartment. Gloria had approached her at a bar with an offer that seemed too good to be true. Seduce Marcus, help the family get rid of his unsuitable wife, get pregnant with the Whitfield heir, become the new Mrs. Whitfield in return. Victoria would receive $5 million and a place in one of the oldest families in Connecticut. "I thought it was just about divorce," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face now. "I thought they wanted Eleanor gone, not dead. I was young and stupid, and I wanted so badly to believe that someone was going to rescue me from my life." "What changed?" The way Marcus talks about her, the way Gloria looks at me sometimes, like I am a tool they are using, not a person they care about. She wiped her eyes. And then Gloria got drunk at Christmas last year and said something that scared me. What did she say? She said removing obstacles gets easier the second time. She was looking right at me when she said it, and I knew I was not going to see that $5 million. I knew I was going to end up like Christine. Jack processed this information carefully. Would you help us? Would you record conversations? Get evidence we can use to bring them down? Victoria was quiet for a long time. If I do this, if I help you, will you protect me? I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. I have resources, I have people, and I have a very strong motivation to see the Whitfield family destroyed. Victoria nodded slowly. Then yes, I will help, because if I do not help stop them, they are going to kill me anyway. At least this way I have a chance. Chapter 8. The Recording. 3 days later, Victoria called Jack with news that would change everything. I got something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Gloria was on the phone in her study. She did not know I was in the hallway. She was talking about Eleanor, talking about how convenient it would be if she did not wake up from the coma, talking about how doctors can be persuaded to make certain decisions about patients who are unlikely to recover. Jack's grip tightened on his phone. Did you record it? Every single word. She talked for 15 minutes. She mentioned Christine. She mentioned payments to the medical examiner. She mentioned a contact at the hospital who could make sure Eleanor never wakes up. Can you send it to me? I already uploaded it to 3 different cloud services with passwords only I know. If anything happens to me, it automatically sends to a list of email addresses, including yours, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country. For the first time in 3 weeks, Jack felt something like hope. That night, he and Daniel met with federal prosecutors in New York City. The state system in Connecticut was too compromised by Whitfield money and influence. But federal prosecutors had no loyalty to local donors. The evidence was mounting. The case was building. And then everything fell apart. 2 days after her call with Jack, Victoria Reeves was found dead in her apartment. The official cause of death was overdose. The police report said she had a history of recreational drug use. The medical examiner who signed the death certificate was the same one who had handled Christine Whitfield's case 8 years ago. Jack stood in his hotel room, staring at the news report on his phone, feeling something cold and hard settle into his chest. Daniel was on a conference call with the federal investigators he had been working with. When he hung up, his face was grim. The recording she made is gone. Her phone is missing. They cleaned the apartment before the police even arrived. The backup. She said she had backups in the cloud. Deleted, all of them. They must have had her passwords. Daniel rubbed his eyes. They got to her before we could protect her. Jack said nothing. We are not done, Daniel said, putting his hand on his brother's shoulder. We still have the retired detective. We still have Margaret. We still have the former employees. We still have the financial records. This is not over. Jack finally spoke. His voice was quiet and controlled. Gloria Whitfield killed 3 women now. Christine 8 years ago. Victoria 2 days ago. And she is trying to kill Eleanor in that hospital bed. He turned to face his brother. She is not going to get away with it. I do not care how much money she has. I do not care how many judges she owns. I do not care if I have to burn down everything I have built to do it. That woman is going to pay for what she has done. Daniel met his eyes without flinching. She will. I promise you. We are going to bring her down. Both of them. The right way. The way they cannot escape. They had no way of knowing that the path to justice would come from somewhere unexpected, that the woman fighting for her life in a hospital bed would be the one to finally end the Whitfield reign of terror. Chapter 9. Eleanor wakes 18 days after the attack. Eleanor Mitchell opened her eyes. The first thing she became aware of was the beeping of machines, then the smell of antiseptic, then the weight of someone holding her hand. The first face she saw was Jack, sitting in the chair beside her bed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Hey, little sister," he said, his voice cracking. "Welcome back." She tried to speak, but her throat was too raw. The tube that had kept her breathing for over 2 weeks had left its mark. But her eyes asked the question she could not voice. "The boys are okay," Jack said immediately, understanding. "Samuel and Thomas. They are fighters just like their mama. They are getting stronger every day. They are going to be fine," Eleanor cried then. For the first time in weeks, they were tears of relief. Daniel appeared beside Jack. He looked exhausted. He looked determined. "We have been busy while you were sleeping," he said. "We need to tell you everything that has happened, but first you need to rest. Get your strength back." Eleanor shook her head. She found her voice, barely a whisper. "Now, tell me now." So they told her everything. The investigation that had been opened and then suppressed, the evidence they had gathered, and the evidence that had been destroyed, Gloria's counterattack through the legal system, Victoria's death, and most importantly, the federal case that was still building despite every obstacle the Whitfields threw at it. When they finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time, processing everything. "I must look terrible," she finally said. Jack almost laughed through his tears. "You look like someone who survived something that should have killed her. That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Daniel smiled, despite the gravity of everything they had discussed. "Also, yes, objectively speaking, you look terrible, but we will work on that." Eleanor laughed weakly. It hurt. She did not care. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor recovered slowly but steadily. The doctors were amazed at her progress. They had expected brain damage, cognitive impairment, a long rehabilitation that might never fully restore her function. Instead, Eleanor came back stronger than she had been before, as if the experience had burned away everything weak and left only steel. She met her sons for the first time, tiny fighters in their NICU incubators. She pressed her hands against the glass and promised them, through her tears, that she would never let anything hurt them, that she would build a world where they would be safe. She talked to the federal prosecutors. She answered their questions for hours at a time. She provided testimony about everything she had witnessed and documented during her marriage. And she made a decision. Her brothers wanted her to rest, to focus on recovery, to let them handle the legal battle while she concentrated on healing and bonding with her sons. Eleanor refused. "I spent 6 years being passive," she said. 6 years being controlled. 6 years being managed and manipulated, and told that I was not capable of handling the truth about my own life. Not anymore. She looked at Jack, then Daniel, then back again. "I am going to testify. In open court. I am going to look Marcus in the eye and tell the world exactly what he did to me. And I am going to watch him fall." Value Lesson 3. Taking back your story. If you have ever felt powerless in your own life, if you have ever felt like someone else was writing your story, and you were just a character following their script, then you know what Eleanor felt in that hospital bed. Survival is not just about living through the trauma. It is about refusing to let the trauma define the rest of your life. It is about taking back the story they tried to write for you and writing your own instead. For 6 years, Marcus had controlled Eleanor's narrative. He told her what to think, who to see, how to feel. He isolated her from everyone who might have shown her a different perspective. But here is the truth that every survivor eventually discovers: they cannot control your story unless you let them. They cannot define you unless you accept their definition. Eleanor could have let Marcus's version of events stand. She could have accepted a settlement. She could have taken her children and disappeared, built a quiet life somewhere far away, never looked back. Instead, she chose to fight. She chose to stand up in a courtroom and tell her truth in front of the world. She chose to take back her story. That choice required courage. It required support from people who believed in her. It required accepting that the process would be painful and public and uncertain. But it also gave her something that no amount of money or settlement could provide: agency, control. The knowledge that she was no longer a victim of someone else's story, but the author of her own. Whatever you are facing in your life, remember this: you have the power to take back your story. It might be hard. It might be scary. It might require help from people who love you. But you are stronger than you know, and your story is yours to write. Now let us see how Eleanor finished writing hers. Chapter 10: The Net Tightens. The federal investigation expanded rapidly in the weeks following Eleanor's awakening. The retired detective testified under oath about the pressure he had faced to close Christine's case. He brought documentation he had secretly kept for 8 years, records that contradicted the official findings, evidence of interference from local officials. 3 former Whitfield household employees provided affidavits about what they had witnessed over the years: physical abuse, verbal abuse, the systematic isolation of both Christine and Eleanor, patterns of behavior that spanned decades. Financial forensics revealed the full scope of Gloria's empire of corruption. She had transferred $10 million to offshore accounts the week after Christine died. She had made payments to the medical examiner. She had funded politicians who then intervened in investigations. And then the FBI found Victoria's backup. The recording she had made of Gloria was stored in a cloud account that the Whitfields did not know existed. It was under a fake name, with a password that Victoria had never written down anywhere. She had told Jack about 3 backups, but she had made 4. The recording captured 15 minutes of Gloria discussing how convenient it would be if Eleanor did not wake up from her coma. It captured references to Christine's death. It captured mentions of contacts at the hospital who could make certain things happen. And it captured Gloria saying the words that would destroy her: "We have done this before. We can do it again. Dead women cannot testify." Federal prosecutors expanded the charges. This was no longer just about what Marcus did to Eleanor. This was about a pattern. A criminal conspiracy spanning decades. A family that had been eliminating inconvenient women and covering up their crimes with money and influence. Marcus and Gloria did not know what was coming. They thought they had won. The local investigation was closed. The evidence was suppressed. Victoria was dead. Eleanor was barely out of her coma and would surely be too traumatized to testify effectively. But they did not know about the federal case. They did not know about the 4th backup recording. They did not know that their empire was about to collapse around them. The arrests happened simultaneously on a Tuesday morning in October. FBI agents arrived at Whitfield Capital Management during a board meeting. 24 executives watched as Marcus Whitfield was read his rights and led out of the building in handcuffs. Jack may have tipped off a few reporters about the timing. The footage of Marcus being perp-walked past dozens of cameras would be the lead story on every news channel that night. Gloria was arrested at her country club during a charity luncheon for the Children's Hospital Foundation. She had just finished giving a speech about the importance of protecting vulnerable children when the agents appeared. The irony was not lost on anyone. She screamed about her lawyers, about her connections, about how the FBI was making a terrible mistake that would cost them everything. Nobody listened. The charges were extensive. Marcus Whitfield faced attempted murder, assault causing grievous bodily harm, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Gloria Whitfield faced conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of both Christine Whitfield and Victoria Reeves, racketeering, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and accessory to attempted murder. The Whitfield empire began to crumble within hours of the arrests. Stock prices collapsed, board members resigned, business partners issued statements distancing themselves from the family. And Eleanor watched it all from her hospital room, her babies finally strong enough to be held in her arms, her brothers at her side. "It is happening," Daniel said quietly. "Everything we worked for." Eleanor nodded, but she did not celebrate. "Not yet. We are not done until they are convicted, until a jury looks them in the eye and says guilty, until they are locked in cells where they cannot hurt anyone else." She looked down at Samuel and Thomas, sleeping peacefully against her chest. "Until then, we keep fighting." Chapter 11. The Trial. The trial began in January and lasted 4 weeks. Every day, Eleanor walked into that federal courtroom with her brothers on either side of her. She sat in the front row behind the prosecution table. She listened to every word of testimony. She watched the evidence accumulate, and she waited for her turn. The prosecution presented a devastating case, medical records showing injuries inconsistent with a fall, financial documents tracing decades of corruption, witness testimony from people who had kept quiet for years out of fear, and the recording, Gloria's voice, captured forever, saying dead women cannot testify. The defense tried everything. They claimed Eleanor was mentally unstable. They presented expert witnesses who testified about pregnancy-related psychosis and false memories. They suggested that her injuries could have been self-inflicted. They claimed the financial evidence was fabricated. They brought in accountants who tried to explain away the offshore transfers and suspicious payments as legitimate business transactions. They claimed that Victoria's recording was taken out of context, that Gloria had been discussing a television show, not confessing to murder. None of it worked. The jury saw through every lie. They saw the pattern. They saw the truth. When Eleanor finally took the stand, the courtroom went absolutely silent. She walked slowly to the witness chair. She was still healing. Her movements were careful, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. She sat down and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the attack. He was sitting at the defense table, flanked by his team of lawyers, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. She did not flinch. "Mrs. Mitchell," the prosecutor said, "can you tell the court what happened on the night of September 14th of last year?" Eleanor told them everything. She described finding the receipt, the discovery of the messages and the affair, the isolation from her family, the 3 days of imprisonment in her own home. She described the nurse who drugged her, the phone calls she overheard, the escape attempt that was intercepted because Marcus monitored her every move. She described the moment he discovered the burner phone, the rage in his eyes, the words he spoke as he beat her. "The babies are mine, my bloodline, my heirs, You are just the vessel. She described falling against the fireplace, the pain that exploded through her body, the fear for her babies that was worse than any fear for herself, the darkness that swallowed her. The jury listened in absolute silence. Several of them were crying. When the prosecutor asked about Marcus's behavior during their 6 years of marriage, Eleanor described the control, the monitoring, the isolation from her family, the slow, systematic erosion of her confidence until she barely recognized herself. Then she held up 2 photographs. These are my sons, Samuel and Thomas. They spent the first weeks of their lives fighting for survival in the NICU. Because of what this man did, they will carry the effects of their premature birth for the rest of their lives, because he decided that beating their mother was worth the risk to them. She turned to face the jury directly. Marcus Whitfield does not see women as people. To him, we are obstacles to be removed, or tools to be used, or possessions to be controlled and discarded when we are no longer useful. Her voice grew stronger. Christine was not a person to him. She was an inconvenience who needed to be eliminated. Victoria was not a person. She was a tool who knew too much. I was not a person. I was a vessel for his heirs. She stood taller in the witness chair. But here is what he never understood, what his mother never understood, what this entire family never understood. We are people, and people fight back. The defense attorney tried to shake her during cross-examination. He implied she was exaggerating. He suggested her injuries could have been from the fall alone. He questioned her mental state. Eleanor answered every question calmly and directly. I know what happened to me. I was there. I know what I saw. I know what I documented. I know what I heard. No amount of expensive lawyers can change the truth of what this man and his mother did. She looked at the defense attorney with something like pity. And no amount of money can buy back the lives they destroyed. The jury deliberated for 12 hours. They returned with their verdict on a Friday afternoon. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the walls. The entire country was watching. For Marcus Whitfield, on the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of assault causing grievous bodily harm, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, guilty. On all remaining charges, guilty. The sentence, 45 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. For Gloria Whitfield, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Christine Whitfield, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Victoria Reeves, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, guilty. On all remaining charges, guilty. The sentence, life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Marcus screamed when the verdict was read. He screamed about injustice. He screamed about lies. He screamed about how Eleanor had destroyed his family, how she had turned everyone against him, how she would regret this. The irony of a man who had nearly beaten his pregnant wife to death screaming about being victimized was not lost on anyone. Gloria said nothing when her verdict was read. She simply stared at Eleanor across the courtroom with cold, empty hatred until the guards led her away in handcuffs. Eleanor watched them both go. She felt no triumph, no joy, just exhaustion and relief. It was over. You did it, Jack said quietly beside her. It is finally over. Eleanor shook her head. No, it is just beginning. Chapter 12, 5 years later. The house in Austin. Texas was nothing fancy. A modest 3-bedroom with a garden out front that Eleanor tended herself every morning. White shutters, a porch swing, The kind of house where children could play safely in the backyard and laughter could echo through the rooms without fear. Samuel and Thomas, now 5 years old, ran screaming through that backyard while their Uncle Jack chased them with a garden hose. They were identical twins, all mischief and energy and joy. You would never know from looking at them that they had started their lives fighting for survival in a NICU. Daniel sat on the porch reading a legal brief, occasionally yelling things like, "Do not climb that tree," and "That bug is not food," without looking up from his work. Margaret Crawford, who had relocated to Texas and become the unofficial grandmother to the boys, brought out a tray of lemonade and watched the chaos with a smile. She had never had grandchildren of her own who lived nearby. Now she had two who called her Grandma Margaret and fought over who got to sit next to her at dinner. "Mom?" Samuel came running up, covered head to toe in mud. Uncle Jack fell in the flower bed. Thomas was right behind him. He said a bad word from somewhere in the garden. Jack's voice called out. I said, "Fudge." I definitely said, "Fudge." Daniel still did not look up from his brief. "You definitely did not." Eleanor laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded and free. The kind of laugh she had forgotten she was capable of during those 6 years with Marcus. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, trapped in a life that was slowly suffocating her, controlled by a man who saw her as property, isolated from everyone who loved her. That woman felt like a stranger now, like a character in a story she had read once, long ago. The Whitfield empire had collapsed completely after the trial. Assets were seized by the federal government. Properties were sold to pay legal judgments. The name that once commanded respect in Connecticut society now carried only shame. Gloria had died in prison 2 years after her conviction. Heart attack. She was alone in her cell when it happened. No one was there to hold her hand or tell her it would be okay. Eleanor felt nothing when she heard the news. Not joy, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement that one chapter had truly ended. Marcus remained in federal custody. He would die there. Eleanor never thought about him anymore. He had taken enough of her mental energy for one lifetime. She had built a new life from the ashes of the old one. She worked part-time as a victim's advocate at a domestic violence shelter, helping other women recognize the warning signs and escape before it was too late. She had written a book about her experience that became a bestseller, donating the proceeds to organizations that helped abuse survivors rebuild their lives. She spoke at conferences about domestic violence, about the way wealth and status can hide abuse, about the importance of documentation and trusting your instincts. But mostly, she raised her boys, she watched them grow, she taught them about kindness and strength and the difference between control and love. She showed them what it meant to treat women as people rather than possessions. She built the life she had almost lost, and it was beautiful. One evening after the boys were in bed, Eleanor sat on the porch with Jack and Daniel. The Texas sky was full of stars, more stars than you could ever see in Connecticut. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming when I needed you, for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself, for fighting when I could not fight anymore." Jack shrugged like it was nothing. "You are family. That is what family does. We show up," Daniel smiled. "Besides, I needed a good federal racketeering case for my resume. Do you know how hard those are to come by in Texas?" Eleanor laughed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies blink in the garden. "Do you ever think about it?" Daniel asked eventually. "What would have happened if Margaret had not called us if we had not gotten there in time?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment. Sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about how close I came to dying, how close the boys came to never being born, how close everything came to being erased. She looked up at the stars. But I try not to live in what ifs. I survived. The boys survived. We are here now. We have this. She gestured at the house, the garden, the life she had built. That is what matters. Jack raised his glass of lemonade. To surviving, Daniel raised his. To justice, Eleanor raised hers. To living, really living. After everything, they clinked glasses as the crickets sang their evening song and the stars wheeled overhead. Epilogue: the lesson. Marcus Whitfield had tried to erase Eleanor Mitchell. He had tried to silence her, control her, destroy her. Instead, he had set her free. This story is not really about revenge, even though it might seem that way. It is not about making bad people suffer. Even though they did, this story is about something more important. It is about reclaiming your life when someone tries to take it from you. About family that shows up when everything falls apart. About justice that does not always come from courtrooms, but sometimes does when good people refuse to stop fighting for it. It is about surviving the worst thing that ever happened to you. And then, slowly, beautifully, learning to live again. If you are watching this and you are in a situation where someone is hurting you, whether physically, emotionally, financially, or in any other way, I want you to know something important. You are not alone. You are stronger than they want you to believe. There are people who will fight alongside you when you are ready to fight. The National Domestic Violence Hotline number is 1-800-7997-233. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can help you make a safety plan. They can connect you with resources in your area. They can be the first step toward taking back your story. You do not have to wait until things get worse. You do not have to wait until you have proof. You do not have to wait until you have figured everything out. You just have to reach out. Eleanor Mitchell learned these lessons the hardest way possible. She hopes you never have to. But if you do, remember her story. Remember that people fight back. Remember that documentation matters. Remember that isolation is a tactic, not a reality. Remember that your family, whether by blood or by choice, will show up when you need them most. And remember that surviving is not just about living through the trauma. It is about refusing to let the trauma define the rest of your life. Eleanor Mitchell survived. And then she lived. You can too. Final thoughts. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something important, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Every share puts this message in front of someone who might be going through exactly what Eleanor went through. Someone who might need to know that they are not alone. Someone who might need to hear that survival is possible and that there is a life after trauma. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for caring about stories that matter. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember that you are stronger than you know. Disclaimer. This story is created solely for educational and informational purposes. It aims to provide relationship guidance and awareness, not to target or identify any individual. The events and characters depicted are entirely fictional, intended for entertainment and learning. Our content is advertiser-friendly and does not promote hate, offense, or harm in any form. The goal is to help viewers gain insights and make informed decisions based on life experiences.